The air in the Global Operations Center at Fort Meade was cold, sterile, and smelled faintly of ozone and burnt coffee. It was a cathedral of modern warfare, a cavern of darkened glass and shimmering holographic displays where data flowed in rivers of light. Here, wars were fought not with bullets but with bandwidth, not with battalions but with malicious code. Into this digital sanctum walked Sergeant Major Evelyn Reed, retired. She was a ghost from another era. Her uniform, the Army Green Service uniform, was perfectly pressed, but its design was a decade out of date. It was a quiet statement of defiance against the pixelated camouflage patterns worn by everyone else. She was 67 years old, her face a roadmap of fine lines etched by sun and worry, her silver hair pulled back in a severe, regulation bun. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a lifetime of discipline, her back ramrod straight, her gaze steady. But it was the single metal pinned above her right pocket that drew the most attention. It wasn't the gleaming, laser-etched hardware of contemporary conflicts. It was an old Distinguished Service Cross, its silver finish worn down to a dull pewter, the ribbon frayed at the edges. It looked less like an award and more like an artifact. Captain Eva Rostova, a cyber warfare analyst whose fingers could dance across a keyboard like a concert pianist, leaned toward Major Kenji Tanaka. "Look at that," she whispered, her voice a low hum of condescension. "They must have dug her out of a museum. Is this some kind of veteran appreciation stunt?" Tanaka, a drone swarm strategist whose mind operated in three-dimensional tactical overlays, adjusted his rimless glasses. He didn't look at Evie directly, but at her reflection in the black mirror of his monitor. Thorne's idea. Some new Pentagon initiative. Integrate legacy experience. It means we get a mascot. Their laughter was quiet, a shared vibration of youthful arrogance. They were the new gods of this domain, Ivy League graduates who saw warfare as a complex algorithm to be solved. To them, Evelyn Reed was an analog relic in a digital world, a dial phone at a smartphone convention. Her presence was an absurdity. General Marcus Thorne, commander of U.S. Cyber Command, met her at the center of the operations floor. He was a man carved from granite, his jaw perpetually set, his 4-star rank gleaming on his collar. He offered a handshake that was firm but brief, his eyes sweeping over her with a dismissive professionalism. "Sergeant Major Reed," he said, his voice resonating with the practiced authority of a man who commanded unseen armies. "Welcome to the GOC. We appreciate you volunteering your time." The word volunteering hung in the air, subtly framing her as a hobbyist, not a professional. "Happy to be of service, General," Evie replied. Her voice was calm, level, with a gravelly timbre that decades of shouting orders over engine noise had failed to erase. "We've set up a workstation for you over there," Thorne said, gesturing vaguely toward a forgotten corner of the vast room. It was a small, gray desk with an outdated monitor, far from the central holographic table where the real work was done. "You'll have observer status. Feel free to acclimate." It was a dismissal disguised as a welcome. She was being placed in the corner like a dusty trophy, a symbol of a bygone era for the young officers to glance at and feel superior. Evie simply nodded, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, General." As she walked to the desk, she felt the weight of their stares. They saw a grandmother in a soldier's uniform. They saw a faded medal and an obsolete skill set. They saw a story that had ended long ago. They had no idea she was a weapon they couldn't yet comprehend. She sat down, her back to the room, and watched the silent, flickering war play out on the screens before her. The next morning, the GOC was a hive of activity. Operation Crimson Edge, the most advanced cyber wargame ever designed, was set to begin. It was a full-scale simulation pitting Cyber Command's top talent against a new generation of AI, a digital aggressor programmed to mimic the evolving tactics of the nation's most sophisticated adversaries. General Thorne stood before the main holographic display, a shimmering globe of interconnected networks. "All right, people, listen up," he boomed. "Crimson Edge is the culmination of 3 years of development. This AI, codenamed Cerberus, is designed to learn, adapt, and exploit weaknesses we don't even know we have. Rostova, Tanaka, you're on point. Walk us through the opening strategy. Captain Rostova stepped forward, her confidence radiating. A complex schematic of defensive algorithms and offensive code packets bloomed in the air before her. General, our primary defense is Project Chimera. It's a multi-layered, deceptive network topology. Cerberus will think it's infiltrating our primary grid, but it will actually be shunted into a recursive sandbox. While it's trapped, our counteragents will map its core programming and deploy a nullification virus. Major Tanaka followed, gesturing to a swarm of virtual drones that filled the holographic space. Simultaneously, my drone squadrons will launch a kinetic denial simulation. We'll secure physical infrastructure, power stations, server farms, communication hubs. Cerberus can't win if it can't touch the real world. We control the physical domain, we control the fight. It was a brilliant, intricate plan, a symphony of digital and physical dominance. The young officers murmured in approval. Thorn nodded, a rare glimmer of a smile on his lips. Impressive. It's clean, it's surgical. From the back of the room, a quiet voice cut through the hum of servers. General? All heads turned. It was Evelyn Reed. She stood by her forgotten desk, her hands clasped behind her back. The sudden attention of the entire room didn't seem to faze her. Thorn's expression tightened. The smile vanished. Yes, Sergeant Major? Do you have a question? The tone was painfully polite, the kind one uses for a child who has interrupted adult conversation. Your plan assumes the adversary is rational, Evie said, her gaze fixed on the holographic display. It assumes the goal is network supremacy. What if it isn't? Rostova scoffed, a barely audible sound. Sergeant Major, Cerberus is an AI. It operates on logic and objectives. It is the definition of rational. An AI programmed by humans, Evie countered softly. Humans aren't always rational. Sometimes the goal isn't to win. Sometimes it's just to make the other side lose, to create chaos. What's your contingency for an enemy who's willing to burn down the board, not just capture the king? The room was silent. The question was so simple, so fundamentally analog, that it seemed almost foolish in this high-tech environment. It was a question about psychology, not processing power. General Thorn's jaw clenched. He saw this as a challenge to his team, to his entire command philosophy. He saw it as the rambling of an old soldier who didn't understand the new battlefield. Sergeant Major, he said, his voice dripping with condescension, we are dealing with terabytes of data per second, not a skirmish in some dusty village. The human element is a variable we have modeled and controlled. Your concern, while noted, is outside the scope of this exercise. We fight with firewalls, not feelings. A few of the junior analysts snickered. Tanaka looked away, a smirk playing on his lips. Rostova simply turned her back, dismissing Evie completely. The message was clear. You don't belong here. Your time is over. Evie held the general's gaze for a long moment. She didn't argue. She didn't defend her position. She simply gave a slow, deliberate nod and returned to her seat. She had offered a warning. They had refused to hear it. Now all she could do was wait. The game was about to begin, and she had a sinking feeling that the simulation was the least of their worries. Launch Crimson Edge, Thorn commanded, his voice sharp, eager to move past the interruption. On the main screen, a single line of text appeared. Simulation initiated. Cerberus online. The game began. For the first hour, everything went according to plan. Rostova's Project Chimera performed flawlessly, identifying the initial probes from Cerberus and shunting the AI's attacks into the sandbox environment. Green lines of code representing defensive measures elegantly repelled red streams of simulated malware. Tanaka's virtual drone swarms blanketed icons of critical infrastructure, their status indicators glowing a confident, steady blue. A quiet hum of self-congratulation filled the GOC. See, Rostova murmured to Tanaka, loud enough for those nearby to hear. It's a machine. It does what it's told. It follows the logical path right into our trap. General Thorne watched from his command pulpit, a stern but satisfied expression on his face. This was the validation of his vision. A new generation of warfare, clean, efficient, and utterly dominated by American technological superiority. Evie Reed watched from her corner, her face impassive. She wasn't looking at the elegant dance of code on the main screen. She was watching the secondary monitors, the ones displaying the raw, unglamorous data streams. Power consumption reports from regional grids. Satellite uplink latency charts. Civilian network traffic analysis. The boring, logistical guts of the system. And she saw something wrong. A flicker. A tiny, almost imperceptible anomaly in the power grid feeding a data center in rural Oregon. The system automatically corrected it in less than a millisecond. It was the kind of transient fluctuation that happens 1,000 times a day. But it was followed by another in Ohio. Then a third in Virginia. They were geographically random, too small to trigger any alarms, but they weren't random in time. They were occurring at precise, 15-second intervals. It was a rhythm, a pulse. "General," Evie said, her voice cutting through the relaxed atmosphere. It wasn't loud, but it had a new edge, a command tone that had been dormant for years. Thorne turned, annoyed at the second interruption. "What is it now, Sergeant Major?" "Shut down the simulation," she said flatly. "Kill the connection. Now." The audacity of the command stunned the room into silence. Rostova spun around, her face a mask of indignation. "You can't be serious. We're about to break their core logic. We're winning." "You're not winning," Evie said, her eyes still glued to the data feeds. "You're being distracted. This isn't a game." As if on cue, the world tilted. The main holographic display, which had been a testament to order and control, suddenly fractured. The confident green and blue lines dissolved into a chaotic static of angry red. An alert klaxoned through the room, a jarring, physical sound in the usually silent digital space. System-wide anomaly detected. The screen flashed. External intrusion beyond simulation parameters. "What the hell is going on?" Thorne roared, his composure shattering. "Rostova! Report!" Rostova's fingers flew across her console, her face paling. "I don't know, sir. It's not Cerberus. This is something else. It's everywhere." It bypassed Chimera completely. It didn't come through the front door. It was already inside. The simulation was a Trojan horse. It used our own wargame protocols to grant itself root access. Panic, cold and sharp, began to ripple through the GOC. On the network maps, city after city began to blink red. It started with infrastructure. The traffic light grid in Los Angeles went dark, causing immediate gridlock. The water purification systems in Dallas reported critical failures. The electronic locks on a federal penitentiary in Illinois disengaged simultaneously. "Tanaka, what's the status of your drones?" Thorne yelled. Tanaka's face was ashen. "They're not responding, sir. I've lost control. Their navigation systems are being spoofed. They're broadcasting their own tactical data to an outside source. They're mapping us." The lights in the GOC flickered violently, then dimmed to a blood-red emergency glow. Heavy steel shutters slammed down over the windows, encasing them in a concrete tomb. Quarantine protocol engaged. Facility on lockdown. They were trapped. The most advanced cyber warfare facility on the planet had become a prison, its own defenses turned against it. The young, brilliant minds who had been so confident moments before were now staring at their screens in frozen horror. Their complex algorithms were useless, their elegant strategies reduced to digital rubble. They had been utterly and completely outmaneuvered. General Thorne stood frozen, watching his command, his career, and a significant portion of the nation's infrastructure crumble in real time. His face, usually a mask of unshakable authority, was now a portrait of raw, helpless fury. The enemy wasn't just at the gates. It was inside the throne room, wearing the king's crown. In the crimson twilight of the emergency lighting, amidst the rising tide of panic, Only one person in the room was completely calm. Evelyn Reed stood up from her desk and began to walk toward the center of the chaos. The cacophony of alarms and panicked shouts filled the GOC, but Evie moved through it as if in the eye of a storm. The young titans of cyber warfare were paralyzed, their faces illuminated by cascading error messages. They were digital natives drowning in a sea of corrupted data. They knew the language of code, but the enemy was speaking in a dialect of pure chaos, and they were fluent. Evie reached the central command console, where a frantic Rostova was trying to execute commands that were being instantly negated. "It's no good," Rostova stammered, her voice tight with panic. "The malware is self-replicating and polymorphic. It changes its signature every time we try to isolate it. It's like fighting a ghost." "Stop fighting it," Evie said, her voice cutting through the noise. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. Rostova looked up, bewildered. "What?" "You're trying to kill the virus. But the virus isn't the weapon. It's the delivery system," Evie explained, her eyes scanning the chaos on the main screen. She wasn't seeing code. She was seeing tactics. A feint here, a probing attack there, a main thrust hidden behind a wall of noise. "They're using your own sophistication against you. Every countermeasure you deploy gives them more data on your capabilities." She turned to a junior officer whose hands were shaking over his keyboard. "Son, what's the status of the physical network connections?" They're still active, ma'am," he stuttered. "We're firewalled, but the fiber lines are hot." "Get me an axe," Evie said. The officer stared at her as if she'd just asked for a unicorn. "A what?" "An axe. A fire axe. Something heavy. Now." General Thorne, who had been watching this exchange with a mixture of desperation and disbelief, finally spoke. "Sergeant Major, what in God's name are you doing?" "Saving your command, General," Evie replied without looking at him. "The enemy is in the machine, so we are going to take the machine away from them." The junior officer, jolted into action by her sheer certainty, ran to an emergency supply locker and returned with a heavy, red fire axe. The entire room watched, dumbfounded, as Evie took it from him. She hefted its weight, the feel of the worn wooden handle familiar in her hands. She walked to a thick bundle of fiber optic cables that snaked out of the main server core like a metallic python. "Rostova, is this the primary uplink to the global network?" "Yes, but you can't." Evie didn't wait for her to finish. With a grunt, she swung the axe. The sound of splintering plastic and severed fiber echoed through the silent room, a shockingly primitive noise in the heart of the digital age. Sparks flew. The main holographic display, which had been a maelstrom of red alerts, went black. The only light came from the dim emergency bulbs and the individual battery-powered monitors. They were cut off. They were blind. But so was the enemy. "You've just isolated us," Thorne roared. "We have no connection to the outside world. We can't see what they're doing. They can't see what we're doing either." Evie shot back, her voice ringing with authority. "And they can no longer use our own network to attack the rest of the country. We've just cauterized the wound." She turned to Tanaka, whose drone expertise was now useless. "Major, your drones. They're broadcasting their location. Are they still on the facility's internal power grid?" "Yes," Tanaka said, his voice barely a whisper. "Cut the power to the drone hangar. The whole sector. Kill the circuit breakers manually. And get me a hardline telephone. A real one with a dial tone. Not VoIP. I need a POTS line to the Pentagon's continuity bunker." Her orders were simple, brutal, and utterly analog. In a world of surgical code, she was performing battlefield amputation. The young officers, trained to think in networks and protocols, were stunned. But they were also lost. Her decisiveness, her sheer analog certainty, was the only thing that made sense in the overwhelming chaos. One by one, they began to move. Tanaka ran to the power schematics, his mind, once focused on swarm algorithms, now tracing physical wiring diagrams. Rostova, her keyboard useless, began directing teams to physically disconnect secondary servers. Lieutenant Commander Ben Carter, a naval intelligence analyst, found an old emergency phone in a maintenance closet, and began trying to get a secure line. Evie stood in the center of the room, now lit by flashlights and backup power. She was no longer an observer. She was the commander. She wasn't fighting the code. She was fighting the strategist behind the code. And she was beginning to recognize his signature. The feint toward the power grids, the use of their own assets for reconnaissance, the goal of psychological paralysis over simple destruction. It was a playbook she hadn't seen in 35 years. It was a ghost from the Cold War. "Carter," she called out, her voice sharp. "When you get that line, don't ask for the watch officer. Get me General Petrenko. Tell him Echo is on the line. And tell him the bear is awake." General Thorne stared at her, his face a mixture of confusion and a dawning, terrifying realization. His entire world had been built on the premise of technological supremacy. He believed that whoever had the faster processor, the smarter algorithm, would win. In 30 minutes, this old woman with a frayed metal and a fire axe had proven him catastrophically wrong. He had been playing checkers with an enemy who was playing three-dimensional chess, and she was the only one in the room who knew the rules. He watched as his brilliant, technologically adept officers scurried to follow the commands of a woman he had dismissed as a relic. The balance of power in the room had irrevocably shifted. It no longer belonged to the one with the most stars on his collar, but to the one who understood the darkness that had just fallen upon them. The GOC was transformed. The cool, sterile hum of technology had been replaced by the tense silence of a submarine running deep. The only sounds were the shuffle of feet, the clipped, whispered orders, and the crackle of the single precious hardline phone Carter was fighting to secure. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and fear. General Thorne approached Evie, his posture no longer that of a commander addressing a subordinate. It was the cautious approach of a man facing a power he did not comprehend. "Sergeant Major, Reed, what is this? Who are we fighting?" Evie didn't look at him. Her eyes were scanning a printed-out schematic of the national power grid that a junior analyst had tacked to a whiteboard. She was marking locations with a red grease pencil, her movements economical and precise. "You're fighting a memory, General. You've spent a decade preparing for asymmetrical warfare against non-state actors and near-peer competitors who play by your rules. You're fighting an enemy who wrote the original rulebook on deception. Petrenko? The bear." Thorne pressed, his voice strained. "What does that mean?" "General Dmitry Petrenko is the deputy director of the SVR. The old KGB," Evie said calmly. "Back in the 80s, his specialty was deep cover operations and psychological warfare. His call sign was the Bear. He was brilliant. And he was my direct adversary for 5 years." The room, already quiet, seemed to suck in its breath. Rostova, who was standing nearby, stared at Evie, her mouth slightly agape. The old woman they had mocked, the mascot, was talking about going head-to-head with a legendary KGB spymaster. "How do you know this?" Thorne demanded. "What gives you the authority to?" "General," Carter shouted from the corner, his hand cupped over the receiver of the old beige telephone. "I have a line. It's patched through to Raven Rock. But they're demanding to know who's giving the order. They won't connect me to Petrenko without clearance." All eyes turned to Evie. This was the moment of truth. She was a retired sergeant major, a civilian consultant with no formal command authority. In the rigid hierarchy of the military, she was a nobody. Evie walked over to Carter. She took the receiver from his hand. "This is Operator Echo," she said into the phone, her voice dropping into a register of cold, absolute command that no one in the room had heard before. "Authorization code Sierra Victor 9009er. I am invoking Protocol Winter Sunday. Patch me through to General Petrenko on the red line. Now." There was a moment of silence on the other end, then a flurry of frantic, muffled activity. Protocol Winter Sun was a ghost protocol, a relic of the Cold War so secret that most active personnel had never even heard of it. It granted absolute operational authority to a handful of deep cover agents in the event of a decapitation strike on the U.S. government. It was an emergency measure for a world on the brink of apocalypse. Carter, the intelligence analyst, had been running a background check on Evie since she'd arrived, more out of a professional curiosity about the anachronism in their midst. Most of her file was a brick wall of redactions and classified, eyes-only warnings, but the name Echo and the authorization code she'd just spoken triggered a deep archive search. A single, heavily encrypted file began to decrypt on his screen. His eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in profound shock. He looked from his screen to the old woman on the phone, and back again. "General," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "Sir, you need to see this." Thorne strode over to Carter's terminal. He leaned in to read the single paragraph of text that had appeared under a grainy, black-and-white photo of a much younger Evelyn Reed. SGM Evelyn Reed. Call sign Echo. Attached, 7781st Army Unit, Special Activities Detachment. Status: inactive, Deep Reserve. Primary Theater: East Berlin, 1981 to 1986. Mission Profile: Counter-deception, Psychological Operations, Network Infiltration, Analog. Notable engagements: Operation Whisperwind, credited with preventing GRU destabilization of NATO communications during Able Archer 83 exercise. Awarded Distinguished Service Cross Covert Circumstances for actions resulting in the neutralization of 3 deep-cover KGB cells. Subject is considered the foremost authority on Soviet-era Maskirovka, deception doctrine, and its principal architect, Colonel Dmitry Petrenko. The 7781st. The Deception Corps, a unit that, officially, had never existed. They were ghosts, tasked with fighting a shadow war in the back alleys of the Cold War. They didn't use guns. They used lies, false signals, and psychological traps. Evie Reed wasn't just a soldier. She was a master spy, a ghost who had hunted other ghosts in the dark. Her worn, tarnished metal wasn't a relic from a forgotten battle. It was a testament to a secret, brutal war that had never been recorded in the history books. Thorne straightened up slowly, his face drained of color. He looked at Evie, who was now speaking quietly into the phone in fluent, unaccented Russian. He looked at Rostova and Tanaka, whose expressions of youthful arrogance had been replaced by a humbling, silent awe. The smirks, the whispers, the condescension, it all felt like a childish sacrilege now. They hadn't been laughing at an old woman. They had been laughing at a legend they were too ignorant to recognize. The general walked back to the center of the room. He stood tall, but the rigid arrogance was gone, replaced by a weary gravity. He looked at the young, brilliant officers now standing idle, their useless technology dark around them. Then he looked at the one person who was in control. When Evie finished her call and hung up the phone, the room was silent. She turned to face him. General Marcus Thorne, the 4-star commander of the most powerful cyber force on the planet, looked at the retired sergeant major he had dismissed and belittled. "Echo," he said, the call sign feeling foreign but respectful on his tongue. "What are your orders?" The shift in the GOC was seismic. Command didn't just transfer. It was surrendered, willingly and with a sense of profound relief. The young officers, who minutes ago saw Evie as an obstacle, now looked to her as their only hope. Her quiet confidence was a lighthouse in the storm of their failure. "Petrenko is on the other side of this," Evie announced to the room, her voice calm and steady. "This isn't a state-sanctioned Russian attack. This is personal. He's an old man, put out to pasture like me, trying to prove that the old ways are still best. He thinks he can paralyze us with fear and confusion. He's using his classic strategy. Create a crisis so overwhelming that your opponent freezes, unable to choose from 1,000 bad options." She pointed to the darkened holographic projector. "He wants us to be blind. He wants us scared. He wants General Thorne trying to manage a national crisis from a blacked-out bunker. That's the psychological trap. We're not going to play his game. We're going to play mine." Her eyes swept over the faces in the room. "Rostova, Tanaka, Carter, you've spent your careers learning to trust the machine. Now you need to learn to trust your instincts." Rostova, your algorithms are useless, but your mind isn't. You understand network architecture better than anyone. I don't want you to fight his code. I want you to give him a playground. Ma'am, Rostova asked, stepping forward, eager but confused. We severed the main fiber line, Evie explained. But there are thousands of secondary data conduits, cellular relays, microwave links. I want you to open one, just one. A single, low-bandwidth data link. Make it look like a system failsafe, a desperate attempt to regain connectivity. Feed it through the old emergency broadcast system network. It's antiquated, full of security holes he'll recognize from his era. It will be irresistible to him. You want to let him back in? Tanaka asked, horrified. We're not letting him in, Evie corrected. We're letting him think he's getting in. We're going to build him a dollhouse. A perfect, virtual replica of our network. A honeypot. But it can't just be a sandbox. It has to feel real. It has to bleed. She turned to Tanaka. Major, your drones are grounded. But their sensor logs are still intact. I want you to start feeding Petrenko's network carefully selected bits of that data. Make it look like a few drones are still operational and sending back panicked, fragmented reports. Show him chaos. Show him fires in Washington. Show him military units moving to locations they aren't. Corroborate the false reality we're building for him. And to Carter, she said, your intelligence. I need you to use that single link to push out disinformation. Use old, Cold War-era communication protocols. Encrypt it with algorithms he'll recognize and know how to break. Let him intercept messages between the president and the Joint Chiefs discussing a full-scale military response. Make him believe his little demonstration has pushed us to the brink of World War III. It was a strategy of breathtaking audacity. It was pure Maskirovka. They were going to fight deception with deception, lies with bigger lies. They would use the enemy's own methodology against him, creating a phantom reality so convincing that he would be completely blind to what was happening in the real world. General Thorne watched, mesmerized. This was not warfare as he knew it. There were no countermeasures, no firewalls, no overwhelming force. It was a delicate, intricate dance of psychology and misdirection. It was art. For the next 6 hours, the GOC became a theater company, and Evie was its director. Rostova, her genius rechanneled, worked with her team to build the virtual network, a digital Potemkin village. They coded in false vulnerabilities, created phantom data traffic, and even simulated the panicked keystrokes of fictional system administrators. Tanaka carefully curated hours of drone footage, splicing and editing it to create a tapestry of national chaos. Carter, a master of modern intelligence, had to relearn the old arts, crafting messages that were subtly flawed, designed to be discovered and misinterpreted. Evie orchestrated it all. She moved from station to station, offering quiet corrections. Too clean, Rostova. A real network under this much stress would have more data packet collisions. Make it Messier. Tanaka, the shadows on that drone footage are wrong for the time of day. Find another clip. Carter, Petrenko won't believe that phrasing. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs would never use the word untenable. He'd say, unacceptable, change it. She knew her adversary's mind intimately. His ego, his methods, his intellectual blind spots. She was not just countering his attack. She was anticipating his thoughts, baiting him, leading him down a path of his own choosing. As they worked, a new dynamic formed in the room. The hierarchy of rank melted away, replaced by a hierarchy of competence. Junior analysts offered suggestions to majors who deferred to captains, who all looked to the retired sergeant major for the final word. The initial fear was replaced by a focused electric energy. They had been victims. Now they were hunters. Finally, it was ready. Open the gate, Evie said quietly. Rostova typed a single command. On a small, isolated monitor, they watched as the enemy code, the Cerberus virus, poured through the tiny data link they had opened. It was like watching a shark swim into a baited cage. The virus began to map their fake network, to attack their phantom infrastructure, to overhear Carter's fabricated intelligence. On their end, they saw Petrenko's actions clearly. He was moving with arrogant confidence, believing he was dancing through the heart of a crippled U.S. Cyber Command. He saw the chaos they had manufactured and believed it was real. He was so focused on the fictional world they had built for him that he never saw the trap closing. "He's taking the bait," Rostova whispered, a note of awe in her voice. "He's trying to access the launch authenticators for our strategic arsenal." "Of course he is," Evie said calmly. "It's the ultimate prize. He doesn't want to use them. He just wants to prove he can touch them. It's his ego." "The authenticators in the honeypot are coded with the tracer program," Rostova said, a grim smile on her face. "The moment he accesses them, it will ping his physical location, not just his IP address, his actual geographic coordinates." They watched the screen, every person in the room holding their breath. The red malware icon crept closer and closer to the file labeled "Stratlaunch for you." Touched it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a single line of text appeared on Rostova's screen. It was a string of coordinates. A small, nondescript dacha 20 kilometers outside of Moscow. Evie picked up the hardline phone again. She dialed a number from memory. "General Thorne," she said, holding out the receiver. "I believe your men have a target." The respect in the room was no longer just about her past. It was about the brilliant, lethal present. She had not only saved them, she had turned their greatest defeat into a decisive victory, using nothing but cunning and an old ghost's understanding of his enemy. The crisis was over. The GOC was a wreck, a testament to the battle that had been fought. Disconnected cables lay in heaps, white boards were covered in frantic scrawls, and the floor was littered with empty coffee cups. But the main screens were glowing a steady, peaceful blue. Control had been restored. Petrenko, located and isolated by his own government thanks to the undeniable proof Evie had provided, was no longer a threat. His network was dismantled. His career and his last great gambit were finished. A quiet exhaustion settled over the command center. Rostova was slumped in her chair, staring at the lines of code that had almost broken them, now inert and harmless. Tanaka was methodically running diagnostics on his drone fleet, bringing them back online one by one. General Thorne stood on his command pulpit, not barking orders, but just watching his people. His expression a complex mixture of relief, humility, and profound respect. He looked over at the corner desk where Evie Reed now sat, quietly cleaning her reading glasses with a soft cloth. She had receded back into the quiet observer she had been when she first arrived, the mantle of command laid down as easily as it had been taken up. To a newcomer, she would once again look like a simple anachronism, a piece of living history. But to everyone in that room, she was the rock upon which their victory had been built. 2 days later, the GOC was still in recovery mode, but a sense of normalcy was returning. The lockdown had been lifted. The full scope of the averted disaster was being assessed in hushed tones at the highest levels of government. Then, a new alert flashed on the main console, one that made everyone stop what they were doing. Priority visitor. Omega clearance. ETR. 2 minutes. Omega clearance. That meant one person. The tension in the room ratcheted up again. Uniforms were straightened. Desks were cleared. General Thorne moved to the entrance, his posture rigid, his face a mask of formal military bearing. He was ready to receive the commander-in-chief and deliver his report, a report he knew would have been a chronicle of catastrophic failure if not for the woman in the corner. The heavy blast doors at the main entrance slid open with a quiet hiss. The President of the United States walked in, flanked by a small contingent of Secret Service agents. He was a tall man, a former naval aviator whose posture still held the echo of military discipline. The room snapped to attention, a sea of salutes. "As you were," the President said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. General Thorne stepped forward, saluting crisply. "Mr. President." General Thorne, Commander, a Cybercom. "We are secure, and I am prepared to." The President raised a hand, cutting him off gently. He didn't even look at Thorne. His eyes were scanning the room, searching. He walked past the general, past the gleaming Central Command console, past the rows of brilliant young officers standing ramrod straight. His gaze settled on the corner desk. He walked directly toward it, his steps measured and deliberate. The entire room, from the four-star general to the junior-most airman, held its breath, watching in silent confusion. Evelyn Reed had stood up as the president entered. She stood at a simple position of attention, her hands at her sides, watching him approach. She wasn't drinking coffee. She was just waiting. The President of the United States stopped directly in front of her. He looked at her, then down at the old, tarnished Distinguished Service Cross pinned to her uniform. A flicker of understanding, of shared history, passed through his eyes. He had been a young pilot during the Cold War. He knew what some of those old, quiet medals really meant. Slowly, deliberately, the commander-in-chief brought his hand up to his brow in a sharp, formal salute. It was a gesture of profound respect, not from a politician to a citizen, but from one warrior to another. The leader of the free world was saluting the retired sergeant major first. The room was utterly silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the servers. "Sergeant Major Reed," the president said, his voice low and filled with a gravitas that transcended politics. "The nation is in your debt. It's an honor," he paused, then added one more word, a name that only a few in the room now understood. "Echo." Evelyn Reed's back, if possible, became even straighter. She met his salute with her own, her movements crisp and precise, a perfect mirror of his. There were no words of thanks, no self-congratulation. There was only the salute, a silent, powerful acknowledgement of service, sacrifice, and a duty performed in the shadows. She lowered her hand and offered a simple, quiet nod. The president held her gaze for a second longer, then nodded back. He turned and walked out of the GOC as purposefully as he had entered. The blast doors hissed shut behind him. For a long moment, nobody moved. The event, lasting less than a minute, had fundamentally and permanently reordered the universe of that room. General Thorne slowly lowered his own salute, which he had been holding throughout the entire exchange. He looked at Rostova, at Tanaka, at Carter. Their faces reflected his own stunned reverence. The laughter, the whispers, the mockery from days before felt like a distant, shameful memory from another lifetime. They had seen the surface, an old woman, an old uniform, an old medal, and had judged it worthless. Now they understood. They stood in the presence of living history, of a quiet, unassuming giant whose shadow they were not worthy to stand in. The greatest weapon in America's arsenal wasn't a drone, or a virus, or a satellite. It was a 67-year-old woman with tired eyes, a steady hand, and a memory of the cold. And they would never, ever underestimate her again.